Welcome to the Psychedelic Spotlight podcast. I am your host, David Flores, CEO of Global Track Solutions. Now, one of the things that I enjoy the most about hosting this podcast is the opportunity it gives me to connect with individuals who are the foremost experts within their fields. And when we talk about ketamine-assisted therapy and ketamine in general, there are a few experts out there more qualified to speak on this subject than the gentleman joining me here today. He is Dr. Stephen Mandel, and he is the founder and president of Ketamine Clinics of Los Angeles. Dr. Mandel is also the founder of the nonprofit American Society of Ketamine Physicians, Psychotherapists, and Practitioners. Dr. Mandel, is a true honor and privilege to have you joining us here today. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, David. I tell you what, I'm so glad to be here. I too feel privileged.
Well, thank you so much. So with this being your first visit here to the Psychedelic Spotlight podcast, I'd love to give you an opportunity to share with our listeners out there a little bit about your background and experience, more specifically the 40 plus years of experience you have as far as utilizing ketamine, and maybe talk to us a little bit about how that experience led you to the work that you are doing now, which is very important in terms of helping individuals suffering from a variety of different mental health conditions.
Okay, great. I'm going to give you the elevator version, and you can ask more questions if you like. I went to graduate school in clinical psychology. I was doing a PhD and really loving doing psychotherapy. And I had an opportunity to go to medical school. I went to medical school and chose to do anesthesiology, and I became board certified and did anesthesiology for years. In fact, I've been using ketamine as an anesthetic. It was approved in 1970, and I began to use it not that long after, but as an anesthetic. So I did anesthesia, but I continued to be very interested in mood disorders and in psychology in general, but particularly mood disorders. An intellectual interest, and frankly, there was enough depression and other issues in my family that I was really personally interested as well as professionally. So when I began to hear in the last decade of the previous century that this drug, which I knew as an anesthetic, was just doing amazing things at lifting the symptoms of PTSD patients. These were mostly guys coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq who were having ketamine as an anesthetic for their war wounds. And some smart guys realized they not only were having a good anesthetic, but it seemed to be moderating their PTSD symptoms. Anyway, that was so counterintuitive. It took actually years for people to realize that that was what was causing this improvement in their symptoms. But by the early 2000s, the zeros, I was following this very closely. And there were a couple of papers out of the NIH that really impressed me because they took treatment-resistant patients who had not benefited from all the known treatments, and they gave them ketamine, and their depression, their suicidality, their PTSD was lifted. This was astounding. 71% in their series of treatment-resistant patients were benefited. I was amazed, and I was incredulous. This, now it seems like a slam dunk. It did not seem like a slam dunk then. Anyway, I started doing this on patients, actually not charging, just doing it to see if it would work for friends and relatives I knew who had tried everything else and they weren't benefiting, and they were miserable, and it worked. And it was just such an amazing thing that I jumped on it, and I've been doing it. I started doing it around 12 and 13, and I opened my clinic in 2014, and I've been doing it full time only ever since.
Wow. Yeah, most definitely. And I mean, you talk about, the conversation surrounding ketamine, as you mentioned, it really started to change in the early 2000s. I think people have always been familiar with it mostly as an anesthetic, and then of course as a recreational drug. But I feel like here, specifically since it was granted, breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA, the conversation surrounding ketamine has really started to change. And the focus really is now more on its effects as a being incorporated as a treatment for, as you mentioned, depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidality. With that in mind, do you want to talk to us a little bit about, what from a science perspective makes ketamine effective when we talk about integrating it into treatments associated with folks suffering from depression, anxiety, and PTSD?
Well, David, there are four major neurotransmitters, and the traditional drugs for depression target the other three, which comprise less than 20% of the receptors in the brain that are mediated by the transmitters. The dominant transmitter is glutamate, and it over 80% of neurotransmission is glutamate mediated. Ketamine modulates the glutamatergic system. It does this by a long process that actually results in new growth in the brain of connections, of receptors, and of axons, not axons, but dendrites connecting with other neurons in a way that actually increases connection density. You can actually see this on slides in a laboratory situation.
Right. And so, I mean, I think that helps, really give us a good understanding in how it's really being integrated here into psychotherapy and helping individuals, which is so important right now. But, with so much interest now really beginning to pick up surrounding ketamine, we've seen multiple clinics all over the country starting to pop up. Now, I think there's a little bit of good and a little bit of bad with that. I know you've been a very strong and passionate advocate for the safe use of ketamine. Do you want to maybe share a little bit about your thoughts on how you and your clinic are integrating it safely into your practice?
Well, sure, David. First of all, we make sure people are appropriate candidates for ketamine. This is so important. We don't take walk-ins. We don't take people solely because they have a lot of curiosity or because they say, well, I'm hurting and I think this might work. We get to know the patient. We get to actually get information on where the patient is emotionally and physically and spiritually. We get to get a baseline assessment of how troubled they are. And then we prepare them for their ketamine journey. And this preparation is super important. The physical setting in which a patient has his or her treatment and the mental set at the time of treatment are the key variables in determining whether or not there's a positive outcome. A third variable is the level of anxiety. Without good preparation of the setting, without a good mental set, without a reassuring of the patient so the patient feels safe and comfortable, you really diminish the chances of a good benefit.
Right. And I think, being able to take all of that into consideration is so important. But do you want to touch a little bit more on how important it is to, not just, you talk about not taking walk-ins and going through a process of getting to know the patients. You want to, I get asked a lot, and this is why I'd like to pose this question to you. Why is it so important to really go through that evaluation process here before you actually begin a therapy session with a patient?
Because ketamine is a very potent drug, and it can harm as well as helping. And
Right.
you'd like to be sure that you're going to be helping, or at least that you've minimized any chances of harming before you go forward. It's not a Tri-Z. This is not a powder in the back of a bar sometime. This is not a crapshoot in a recreational setting. This is a treatment. And it benefits from being deliberate and cautious and maintaining the dignity of a treatment. It's not it's not fun and games. It's a way of dealing with a very, very serious problem. Depression is the leading cause of disability in the United States. Literally, it's much more than heart disease or accidents or cancer. And 4% of those who are clinically depressed take their lives every year.
Right.
Ketamine reverses suicidality very reliably. In fact, I would say the one time when you might go a little quicker or a little, I don't want to say more casually, but faster at clearing a patient for treatment is when there's reason to believe that suicide is imminent.
Right. Yeah, most definitely. Now, have you noticed an increase in patients at least reaching out to your clinic there in Los Angeles here in the last year? I mean, with everything going on with COVID-19 and the impact that has taken, mentally and emotionally on so many people throughout society, has that led to an increase in patients, again, reaching out to your clinic there?
It's tragic, David. This year has been hellish for people. Everyone who has, not everyone, almost everyone who has substance issues is using more substance. Everyone who has partner issues is being less kind and cordial to their partner and less helpful to their partner. People who are parents aren't parenting as well in the main. It's just exacerbated all the problems people have. This has been like a pressure cooker. We have had tremendous increase in inquiry and a number of patients, but I don't celebrate that at all. I feel terrible for our whole community.
Yeah, it's been, like a pressure cooker, I think is the best way to kind of describe it, unfortunately. In understanding the impact that COVID-19 has taken on the mental health of so many people, I, at least personally, cannot think of a better time and a more critical time here in society for something like ketamine therapy to really become far more prominent. But I, at least from my perspective, I'm really curious to get your take on this. I feel like it's still something that the American healthcare system still looks at with a bit of hesitation. What's your view, being so plugged into the healthcare system and everything involved with treatment? What is your view as far as ketamine becoming a more accepted form of treatment for individuals suffering from these mental health conditions?
David, this is a really amazing treatment. Everyone who's studied it knows that the reluctance for mainstream medicine to embrace it is basically driven by, in a peculiar way, by money. There's very little money in providing ketamine treatment. We usually get our drug information from pharmaceutical houses.
Right.
They have no interest in teaching us about ketamine. Ketamine is off patent. It's widely manufactured, so nobody can corner ketamine. So there's no money. And as soon as there was money in ketamine, when the Janssen company, now wholly owned by Johnson & Johnson, was able to take an isomer of ketamine, that's the same drug, the same molecule, but with a particular shape in space. Ketamine has two isomers, a left and a right, an R and an S. It's just Latin for right and left. When they were able to convince the FDA to permit it to be patented, so that its price then went many multiples of what it had been, then Janssen and Johnson started singing its praises, and it met wide acceptance. Unfortunately, they're using a nasal route of administration, and nasal routes of administration do not work as well. So they're getting about a 40-odd% success rate, where we have about an 80-odd success rate.
Wow.
The other impediment, also to do with money, is that insurance companies have been reluctant to pay for it. Insurance companies don't like to write checks. And it's very easy for them to say that it's an experimental medicine. even though it isn't experimental, or for them to say it's off-label, and it is off-label. And almost 1/3 of all prescriptions written for psychiatric indications in the United States are off-label. So ketamine's in good company. And just to show one of the dramatic proofs of what I'm arguing, that it's really in the insurance company's interest to reimburse for ketamine because it's much more effective than the high-priced nasal spread. I'm not permitted to say its name. Is it just last week, actually the week before now, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts just announced that they will in fact reimburse for ketamine, for generic ketamine given intravenously, because it works.
Right.
And it works so well, their reimbursing for it will actually save that company money.
Right. And that's so encouraging. And I mean, I really think that the work that you have done and that you continue to do here, with the ketamine clinics of Los Angeles, as well as with the American Society of Ketamine Physicians, Psychotherapists, and Practitioners, is really helping pave the way, I think, create the road ahead for ketamine and for it to be looked at and utilized more broadly across the healthcare system. So I really commend you for that. And, with that, I'm sure you have multiple stories of lives that you have touched and changed and perhaps saved through your clinic. Are there any stories that maybe stand out to you the most and that you feel need to be heard as sort of an advocate for why ketamine needs to continue to move forward here?
Thank you. I'm so glad to have been a part of this rollout of salvation, basically, for depression, PTSD, and suicidality. I have a lot of stories, but one of the earliest that bears on your point is a lady who came to me in her mid-60s who said she wanted to try this. This was early on in my career giving ketamine. This was around 2015. And she said, yeah, I'm spending my funeral money because I really believe this has a good chance for me. And as I got to know her, I came back to that and I said, what are you talking about, funeral money? She said, well, I put money aside so that my sons wouldn't be burdened with my funeral. She said, and I said, well, you seem to be in pretty good health. And she said, yes, I am, but I was going to kill myself. And this medicine has made me reconsider that. And I'm so glad I spent it this way instead of that way. It just blew me away. That lady is still around and still smiling. And it's just so gratifying to have been able to make that difference for her. Often I had a patient who was had sold his company for many millions of dollars and had 2 children and a wife and lots of the things that money can buy. And he took to his bed and he really just didn't get out of bed. And he had the resources and the contacts to just mobilize a tremendous amount of talent in his behalf, none of which made any difference. And almost as a last resort, he was brought to me. And 6 sessions later, he was back to managing his own affairs. He was back to being a husband, back to being a father, back to having enthusiasm. We think of depression as kind of like, oh, people are sad. That's just life. Suck it up and get on. Depression is really debilitating. It's really just awful for people. And they don't feel like they're worth anything. They don't feel like they have any joy. They don't feel any pleasure. They're just miserable. And this medicine, in about 80% of them, 83% in our clinic, reverses that feeling.
Right. And I mean, on that, I can speak to that. I watched my father suffer from depression and addiction for so many years and saw him go from a reliance on one pill to another pill until eventually, his life had deteriorated and he ended up passing away far too early,
Oh,
59 years old. And that's really what sort of inspired me, hearing these stories and, not understanding why this isn't something that's more readily available out there and why we're not talking about it more. But again, I feel the work that you're doing, is really helping to push things forward with this. And so my final question to you, Dr. Mandel, would be for individuals out there who still maybe say, this all sounds too good to be true. You cite a 80, 81%, success rate there. I'm sure there's so many people out there that says, no, that can't be. What do you have to say to that? I mean, I know, it's not necessarily black or white, but I mean, what do you have to say to people out there that say this sounds too good to be true?
it certainly does sound too good to be true. And most things that sound too good to be true are too good to be true, and they're not true. So what I would say is read some of the studies, or if you're not into reading studies, read the synopses, the summaries of some of these studies. Go and look at the Yelp page of successful practitioners. Yelp is something practitioners really can't manipulate very well at all. Go see what people have to say, not one or two, but a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen, about how transformative this has been. See how men have been able to become fathers and husbands again, and women have been able to bond with their children. This is really remarkable for postpartum depression. And man, postpartum depression is such a disaster, not just for the mom, but for the baby and the husband too. Go online and go to ketamine chat rooms run by patients for patients. See what they have to say. Yes, it sounds too good to be true. It's quick. It's safe. It works in my clinic 83% of the time. In the general literature, 71% of the time. Even if you just believe the 71, those are damn good odds considering the alternative.
Absolutely. It most definitely does. Dr. Mandel, again, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us here. This has been a really fantastic experience. And there's so many more topics that I'd love to dive into, but hopefully we can have you on again on our show here. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Really glad to do it, David. I appreciate the opportunity. I will definitely make myself available if you have if you can have this happen again.
Oh, absolutely. And we will be sure to get all of the website information for the ketamine clinics of Los Angeles included with this podcast. So Dr. Mandel, thank you so much again.